Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Michael Toms. I'm the director of the Institute for Research in the Social Sciences here at Stanford. I'm also a professor of political science, chair of the political science department, and a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today to the third installment of America Votes 2024, a series of panel discussions about the US election. This series is co-sponsored by three Stanford institutions: the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, also known as CDDRL, directed by Professor Catherine Stoner, and housed here within, thank you, and housed within the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. The second sponsor is the Center for Revitalizing American Institutions, or RAI, directed by Professor Brandis Keynes-Roane, who is our speaker in installment number 2. That center is housed within the Hoover Institution. And the third sponsor is the Institute for Research in the Social Sciences, or IRIS, directed by me and housed within the School of Humanities and Sciences. At Stanford, we are fortunate to have, I think, the greatest group of election experts in the world. My colleagues and I organized this series to share the incredible expertise of our Stanford colleagues with the campus community and the wider world. Today, we have 4 amazing panelists who will make brief presentations about their research as it relates to the 2024 election, and then engage in a lively dialogue with us, the co-moderators, and with you, the audience. I could talk for a long time about their accomplishments, but I won't, because I want to maximize the time for discussion. So let me very briefly introduce our 4 speakers in the order that they will present. Our first presenter is Professor Hakeem Jefferson, Thank you. Assistant Professor of Political Science and a faculty affiliate at CDDRL. Our second speaker is Didi Kuo. Didi? Center Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Our third speaker is Jonathan Roden. Jonathan. He's a professor of political science, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. And our fourth speaker is Anna Grismala-Busse, Michelle and Kevin Douglas Professor of International Studies in the Department of Political Science, senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, and director of the Europe Center here at Stanford. Anna gave the wave. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Professor Jefferson, who will give the first presentation. Enjoy.
Timer and also okay. Now it's official. Thanks, y'all. Thanks for being here. A week before the election, scary times. But we're here to hopefully have some fun conversation and interesting conversation about it. I've been tasked with talking about the role of race and the 2024 election. And so I've titled my remarks today, Race in 2024, the Fight for Multiracial Democracy. And I've made it broad in title because I think there's a tendency sometimes for us to focus on the particulars of these sorts of elections and get really bogged down in the weeds of it. But I think a lot's at stake in this election. And as I'll argue across the next 10 minutes or so, I think the very future of multiracial democracy and all that that entails, which we can get into in the Q&A, is at stake in this election. So I'm going to style this conversation with you all by just making a few observations about what I've observed, and I think what many of us have seen who think and study race. So observation 1, race remains a central organizing feature of American politics and American life, even as some try to avoid it. And by the some trying to avoid it, here I even mean Kamala Harris herself, a person who is strategically, I think, not talking much about either of the really historic features of her identity in this race, though she does from time to time, and we can get into it. But even as Harris herself and the campaign has really steered clear of talking about what it would mean for this woman of color, self-identified Black and Indian woman, to become the first president, even if she doesn't want to talk much about it. We all knew that this was going to be an election in which race was central, because this guy can't stop talking about it and can't exist in a world where we can't talk about it, given that he's a part of this election. And we can get into this in the Q&A about Trump's comments about Harris's identity and perhaps the strategery, to use a George W. Bush word, of him trying to question the authenticity of Kamala Harris's Blackness. This is a pretty straight through line through the way that he treated Barack Obama and calling into question the authenticity of Barack Obama's Americanness. And here he calls into question Kamala Harris's Blackness, perhaps in an effort to lead some Black Americans to discount her as a member of community. But here I really want to showcase this just to say race is a central organizing feature of American politics. It is, in my view, the central organizing feature of American life. But when I teach this with my colleague and dear friend Adam Bonica, he suggests that maybe I can say a central organizing feature just to moderate a little bit, which my colleagues know I don't like to do all that often. Observation 2 is that we cannot escape the legacy of January the 6th and the persistence of white identity politics in this election. In the aftermath of January 6, 2021, I wrote a piece for 538 that said that storming the Capitol was about a defense of white power and defense of racial hierarchy in the US. And I think as we look at this campaign with all of its weirdnesses and uniqueness, what we see is the persistence of white identity politics, especially on the right. And we see this, maybe it's too long ago now, but we remember this with Ron DeSantis and book bans and the like. And we know that these attempts to ban the teaching of America's history around race is in protection of white identity. We know from work that I've done with some social psychologists that information about race and racism threatens white identity, the esteem of whiteness. And we know that this is a really brazen attempt to signal to white Americans that the Republican Party will do their bidding. Michigan colleague Ashley Jardina wrote this great book that you all should read on white identity politics that really, I think, does a good job at explaining Donald Trump, but doing more than explaining Donald Trump, explaining why we see the kind of politics on the right that we see. Political scientists used to think a lot about outgroup antipathy, a sort of negative attitude towards some other. But what we've seen in recent years is really an appeal to a dominant racial identity, especially from candidates on the right. And Donald Trump does it better than anybody else, but he's certainly not the only one on the right who does it. Ron DeSantis tried to do white identity politics light, and it didn't get him very far, but this is a mainstay of the politics of the right in this country, white identity politics. And if you don't believe me, you know, they had the insignia and don the sort of outfits and the like of the Confederacy on January the 6th. And this is just a reminder that, you know, political scientists like to talk about a lot of things, including polarization, misinformation, disinformation. I want us to think about what's happening, especially on the right, as a defense of white racial identity and a defense of a particular racial hierarchy. And in my view, that's the main story of what's been happening on the right, a real appeal to a kind of white nationalism in this country. Observation 2 was about the legacy of January the 6th and white identity politics. The third observation is the continued reliance on racial appeals, racial priming got really southern there for a second. Racial priming, and really just brazen racism uh, by Donald Trump and by many candidates on the right. And when we use the language of racial appeal, the technical language there, it just means that there's an attempt to appeal to a set of racial attitudes, right? To bring them to the fore of individuals' considerations of some political object, some political outcome. And I'm going to show you the way that politicians do this. They do it in speeches and rhetoric, they do it in campaign advertising, they do it in the way that they frame political issues. And when we talk about how one frames a political issue, how a candidate or a campaign or a party gets you to think about a particular issue. So when we talk about how one can frame the question of immigration, we can talk about it as an economic issue or a security issue. What the right does is many of those things, but they also racialize these policy areas in a way that bring these considerations to mind. And so I just want to show you a couple examples of what we mean when we talk about these racial appeals and racial priming, and we can dig a little deeper in the Q&A. So I'll just show a couple examples that you all are certainly all familiar with.
What do these three criminals all have in common? Edwin Ramos, an illegal immigrant and MS-13 gang member, robbed a pregnant woman, was released, and later brutally gunned down a father and both his sons in San Francisco. Roni Aguilera, an illegal immigrant from Honduras, was arrested, released, and went on to murder a 14-year-old boy with a sword. Alexander Izagir, an illegal immigrant convicted of multiple crimes, was released, given job training by the city, and later robbed the woman in an assault that left her with a fractured skull. What do these criminals all have in common? Each of them was put back on the street by Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris has vowed to defund the police, eliminate cash bail, and grant citizenship to millions of unvetted illegal immigrants. These are dangerously liberal policies that benefit illegal immigrants and criminals, not us. These are criminals for Kamala.
And I'll just show you.
Be sure to subscribe to the Jim Heath channel.
What they have done to our country by allowing these millions and millions of people to come into our country, and look at what's happening to the towns all over the United States. And a lot of towns don't want to talk. It's not going to be Aurora or Springfield. A lot of towns don't want to talk about it because they're so embarrassed by it. In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets. What they have done to our country by.
But what I want to note here is that in the immediate aftermath of Trump's comments about Haitian immigrants, and it's important that we recall that these are Haitian immigrants, he said that they were eating cats and dogs, this old sort of trope about immigrants and Asian American immigrants in particular. There's a long history of this kind of stereotyping in the US. But it's meant to create an image of this disgusting foreign being. Racialization campaign. It's meant to bring to mind a host of negative stereotypes about these groups and your consideration, not just of the immigrants themselves, but of the candidates that you're primed to associate these negative stereotypes with. 2 more minutes. One of the things I want to note here in making this point is some research by Nick Valentino and colleagues, where they observe that there's this changing norm and the way that Americans respond to racialized rhetoric. We saw with Donald Trump throughout the first and second campaign, and now the third, this increase in an explicit kind of racism in the appeals that he is making. And they want to note in this work that there's this greater tolerance for this kind of racist appeal. And I'm just going to zoom through this really quickly, just to note, and this is always a mistake in a crowd like this, but I just want you to pay attention to this dotted line here. These are people who are high in symbolic racism or high in racial resentment. This is how angry or disgusted are they by a story that has an implicit racial appeal or a more explicit one. What do you see with this dotted line? it's flat. People high in racial resentment are not made angrier or more disgusted by explicit racial and racist appeals. That means that politicians can exploit this feature of American life and increasingly use these really explicit racial appeals. Kamala Harris's campaign reflects a really interesting feature of identity politics on the left. We saw it with White Dudes for Kamala Harris, for example. I just want to flag this for Q&A to say that I think this reflects some of the changing aspects of how identity works and left politics in the US and the kinds of coalitions that that allows for. And then finally, you expect me to say something about Black people, so I will, given my expertise. There's been a lot of spotlight on Black men and men of color and the 2024 election cycle. You've all seen these headlines. Kamala Harris has done a lot of work to try and motivate Black men to support her, to shore up support for her candidacy. And there's all this question about whether Black men and men of color more generally are running away from the campaign or from the Democratic Party. I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. But I just want to point out that this is polling data from just a couple of days ago, from October 27th from ABC and Ipsos. And I want you to look at these numbers among likely voters and Black men and Black women. The spread is typical of what we expect. This, in my view, and I'll have egg on my face if I'm wrong, has been an exaggerated narrative about Black men. Among Hispanics, she is doing almost, among likely voters at least, almost as well as Barack Obama and Joe Biden have done. I think that we've exaggerated this narrative to great effect. And I'll end here by noting that I think a lot's at stake in this election. I think the stakes are really high. I think this is an election with multiracial democracy really at stake, and for people of color, for women, and other people, this election couldn't be more critical. And I'm happy to talk more about any of this in the Q&A.
Being here. I'm here to talk about political parties. We have a lot of questions about the parties. I think the media is very split on whether or not parties are strong or weak at any given moment. So here we'll try to contextualize sort of what parties have been doing, what they're failing to do, to try to understand the state of the parties today. We are in a time when there's kind of a paradox about party strength. Parties seem strong, we're highly polarized, they seem very ideologically distinct, the parties are very well financed, and they're good at winning elections. 99% of elections in the United States are won by people identifying with one of the major parties. But parties also seem really weak. They seem unable to select good candidates or to preclude extremist candidates. And also, trust in parties is low and has been on the decline for decades. Quick reminder for those of you who maybe have learned this in a poli-sci class, parties are really important for democracy. Historically, the story of democracy itself is one of parties. Hello? Better? Yeah. Okay, sorry. If you missed anything from before, it was just parties are important. So So independents for a long time were thought of as leaners. They just don't like labels, but they're definitely going to vote for one of the parties. More recent research has shown that people who identify as independents are actually politically distinct. They're more likely to be cynical about politics overall, to think that all political parties are corrupt, and to be less likely to engage in politics. Across the advanced democracies, we've seen a decline in the number of people who have memberships in political parties, which is traditionally how you affiliate with a party across Western Europe, for example. We've also seen vote shares for the mainstream parties of the center left and center right decline. Now, there are any number of reasons for this. In places with multi-party democracy, we've seen a rise in challenger or anti-system parties. What's interesting is that sometimes these are kind of innocuous parties of the left or the right, like Greens parties. But more recently, especially since the financial crisis of 2008, a lot of the parties that are challenging the mainstream parties say that the parties are failing to do anything and that democratic institutions themselves may not be able to adequately respond to what citizens need. Now, many of these parties themselves are not loyal to the institutions of democracy, but they're still using it as a pretext to come to power through democratic elections. There's also research showing that mainstream parties struggle to adapt when new issues are salient and they aren't actually being responsive. So there have been many areas of convergence between the mainstream left and right, particularly in a neoliberal era, that do make it hard to distinguish how they govern differently. So what is it that parties are doing or are failing to do? Well, the history of political parties as organizations was that they relied on labor-intensive campaigns and volunteers. They were often densely spread through a territory with local party offices, and that has really atrophied in an era of the nationalized, professionalized political party. Parties are no longer membership groups, instead affinity groups, and many scholars who write about affective polarization note that people don't really have engagement with political parties, but may sit at home on social media liking, social media posts from the parties that they support, something that Eitan Hirsch at Tufts calls political hobbyism. There's been a professionalization of elections, so much more party focus on fundraising, advertising, and campaigns, rather than the sort of nitty-gritty being out in communities, understanding what it is that people need. There's also less of a party role in the United States, at least, in gatekeeping and candidate selection since the McGovern-Fraser reforms of the 1970s. We now select candidates through primary elections, which makes parties basically unnecessary in the process of candidate selection. There's also been a lot of outsourcing of issue aggregation and mediation to other groups, special interest groups, advocacy groups, et cetera. We also know that over time, there's been less representation of the working class and what scholars term a responsiveness gap in affluent democracies, where policies are often biased towards what the wealthy or the affluent prefer, despite the fact that representatives may represent constituencies that have many people who are lower or in middle income. Now, if you think about the state of the Republican and Democratic parties today, this isn't where I want to spend the bulk of my time, because I do think that it's a little bit in the eye of the beholder. Some people would say the Republican Party is really strong. It's been highly personalized. That means strength in some dimension. Other people would say that a hostile takeover of a party means it was very weak. But here are some things we know about the Republican Party under Donald Trump. We know that his family members served as White House advisors, and now Lara Trump, his daughter-in-law, is a co-chair of the RNC. We know that when Donald Trump re-ran in 2020, the RNC didn't even write a platform. And this year they have a MAGA platform in 2024. I ask you to compare it to 2016, which 2016 was highly professionalized, a slick, sort of many, many pages long platform. This year's looks like it was written, I don't know, in Comic Sans. It's like 2 pages long. It's capitalized in weird ways, like one of President Trump's tweets would be. The establishment GOP has been largely sidelined. Many of them have spoken out in support of Kamala Harris. Many of them lost their seats in primary races to more extremist candidates. The Democratic Party as of 2024 seems like it's really gotten its act together as a party as of June. It decided not to field a candidate against President Biden, who was an incumbent earlier this year when the primary races would have happened. But in June, after a disastrous debate against President Donald Trump, the party leaders, and by that I mean Nancy Pelosi, seemed to coalesce a lot of people. It is amazing what one individual can do, and key figures to back Kamala Harris as soon as the party decided that she would be the nominee instead. There was no primary contest. This is something the Republicans tried to capitalize on. I don't think it's really worked. And instead, we've seen a broad coalition of Democrats, some former members of the Republican Party, that Kamala Harris is trying to wield, and also trying to cobble together a lot of undecideds. And I leave it to Anna to say whether this is an adequate cordon sanitaire, but this is certainly what Kamala Harris's difficult job is next Tuesday. Now, more broadly, we've seen a lot of things happening in the political parties. I already said that the mainstream parties are losing support across the West. One reason is because a class divide that used to be present between left and right has now morphed into an educational divide. On the left is data from the United States, a recently published book called Polarized by Degree, that says that working class support for the Republican Party has gone up if we define working class as people without a college degree, whereas increasingly having a college degree predicts support for the Democratic Party. More broadly, among social democratic and conservative parties in the West, this is also the case, that it used to be the case that conservative parties represented the better educated. Now, social democratic and parties of the left tend to represent higher educated voters, and the working class is increasingly up for grabs, or you see more working class appeals coming from parties of the right. We've also seen, and I think this is a little bit harder to understand intellectually, maybe not an outright displacement of economic issues by cultural issues, but certainly more salience of cultural issues, and arguably maybe a decline in the salience of economic issues. Here, again, for the United States, we see that the share of cultural issue mentions has gone up relative to economic issues. And this graph on the right is for Western Europe, showing that cultural issues have become more dominant in party manifestos over time, while economic ones have declined. Now, part of the story of Western Europe is that the European Union now sets a lot of policy, economic policy, trade policy, macroeconomic management, et cetera, which then takes it out of the realm of contestation for the political parties. But people note similar trends in the United States. And finally, just a little bit more on this sort of argument about who mobilizes people. Traditionally, that work was done by political parties, people who do get out the vote efforts or try to sort of spur voter loyalty between elections. A lot of that is now done by non-party actors in the United States. We know that traditional campaign finance, like the FECA regime that was established in the 1970s, involved basically regulations on how much money you could give to individual candidates and to political parties. But we've seen a real sort of decentralization of the campaign finance regime and the rise of many non-party actors. 501c4s and super PACs can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money, especially after the 2010 Citizens United decision. And the FEC, in a very recent ruling this past spring, now allows candidates to coordinate with outside groups on voter canvassing and get out the vote efforts. So in the past, super PACs are explicitly not allowed to coordinate with a candidate's campaign, but Donald Trump's ground game in a lot of swing states is being outsourced to Elon Musk's super PAC. He's now offering people a chance to enter a lottery to win $1 million if they sign up to register for one of the issues that he cares about. So there's a lot of questionable things happening, and the regulatory regime of campaign finance has struggled to keep up. Two very recent examples. One is people on TikTok, people who are influencers, can be paid, so sponsored content, paid to sell you things, but they do not have to report that they're being paid to send a political message. And there is evidence that both political parties' super PACs, so again, like not officially the party, have spent money on TikTok influencers, and we will basically never know. There's also a story in the New York Times that because of the sort of quarterly reporting requirements at the FEC, a lot of the sort of nonprofits that formed that can give money to super PACs will not have to report their donors. The super PACs won't have to report until after the election. So even if voters wanted information about who these people were, they would not be able to get it in time. Very quickly on political reforms. All of this anti-party sentiment in the United States, in Europe, we've seen it register in support for extremist parties. I think you also see that happening in the US. But we see a reform community that is very active around taking parties out of politics. Right now, there are a few ballot initiatives in these states to replace partisan primaries with nonpartisan primaries. And how this will work is to create a top 2 system like we have in California, or a top 4 or a top 5 system where all of the candidates run in a primary, and those with the top 5 or the top 4 or 5 most vote-getting candidates then advance to the general election. In theory, the hope is that you only pick the moderate candidates, but this has really not been done before, and it is a brainchild of people who I think have a lot of money and really like to be able to select which candidates are going to win without going through any kind of institution whatsoever. But the goal is really just to get parties out of the game of picking candidates. And we do not have much empirical evidence about how these would work. It's sort of been used in Alaska and Maine for one election cycle. So distrust in parties usually registers not necessarily in support for strengthening parties, but rather in opportunities to weaken them over time. And we can talk more about that in Q&A. Thanks.
All right. This will be the rare moment when one talk in a panel actually flows nicely from the previous one. I think there's a lot these two discussions will have in common. So I have 10 minutes to try to convince you to think in a really different way than you're accustomed to thinking about polarization in the United States. The common belief, I think a dominant perspective in thinking about polarization in the US is that we have increasingly homogeneous tribes. The parties are becoming more and more similar in terms of both demographics and beliefs, and they're becoming further apart, and this causes people to have disdain toward the outgroup. This is a consensus view that among elites and the mass publics, that politics is increasingly one-dimensional, meaning that all the different issues start to kind of snap onto one, that people's issue preferences on various issues start to become highly correlated. And there's this one single dimension that on that single dimension of conflict, the parties have both diverged and become more internally homogeneous. And this causes something like group-based tribalism and effective disdain for the out party. I think this essentially is a summary of most books you might pick up on US polarization. Say something along these lines if you've read Ezra Klein's book or many of the main books by political scientists on the topic. So I'm working with my colleague Gary Cox on this topic, and we basically believe that the first thing here is very much true, that the means have diverged. But we think there is no evidence that we can find that the second thing is true, that the parties have become more internally homogeneous. And I want to try to see if I can convince you that something different is happening. So just some quotes from top political scientists. Virtually all observers accept the view that the two parties have become more divergent and more homogeneous. The Democratic Republican parties have become more internally homogeneous, and basically some version of that sentence, that claim you'll find in most of these books. I think right away, I think if you watched the fist fight break out among Republicans on the floor of the U.S. Congress, or if you saw any of the things happening in the leadership battles in the Republican Party, or if you just listen to anything that's going on within the party, there's incredible division, incredible hostility. Many of us have always noted that there's lots of divisions within the Democratic Party, and we always sort of viewed, there's lots of even jokes that go back to Will Rogers and so forth about this. The Democrats, of course, are eternally divided. But it turns out the Republicans are extremely divided as well, and the two parties are really trying to outdo one another and how dysfunctional they can be internally. And I think this builds on some of the things Didi was saying. So I now have 7 or 8 minutes to try to convince you that the parties have not become more homogeneous over time. If anything, they become more heterogeneous. I have a lot of things I could show you, but I don't have time, but I'll just show you a few things and see if I might start to at least open your mind on this topic if it's closed. In comparison with other countries, I want to try to tell you the American parties are extremely heterogeneous, and this is in part a function of our institutions, having a presidential system and having a two-party system. These things push the parties to naturally be quite heterogeneous. And I want to try to convince you that, in fact, in kind of opposition to this basic claim that is made in the literature, it's not the homogeneity of parties that pushes affective polarization and disdain. It's actually the heterogeneity of the parties that do this. And so the story I'll try to tell is that heterogeneous parties create incentives for party message makers to focus their efforts on characterizing the out party as extreme. That is basically what message making in US politics has become focused on. So just to get you started on this first issue of are the parties becoming more homogeneous? When it comes to demographics, both of the parties are becoming more heterogeneous with respect to some of the things I think that we might care about. Whites are falling as a share of identifiers in both parties. But when it comes to education, when you have a kind of something like college degrees, a binary variable, if a minority group is growing, then we would say the party is becoming more heterogeneous. And this is true of college degree holders. There's still a minority in both parties. It's a growing minority in both parties. In spite of the educational realignment that's happening, that's not inconsistent with what I'm saying. When it comes to religion, it is still the case that believers of various kinds are a majority in the Democratic Party. They're, of course, a majority in the Republican Party. Secular people are a growing minority in both parties. The sort of bar stool kind of Trump supporter that is very secular is rapidly making the Republican Party more secular, in fact. When it comes to income, I think it's kind of clear that both parties have become complicated cross-class coalitions. And the correlation between income and voting is really gone. So when it comes to issue preferences, So we can go in surveys and we can look at lots of different questions. So we can look at binary questions, or we can look at continuous questions that people are asked to kind of place their views on, say, a 5-point or a 7-point scale or something. When we do this and we look over time at standard deviations within parties, Gary and I have been looking at lots of different issues, and we see that when we just take the standard deviations of people's answers within the two parties, they're growing on lots of issues. And this is not what the literature seems to suggest, but it's very clear if you look in the data, this is what's going on. And so there's another little thing that's kind of, I think it's obvious ex post once you think about it, but I had never thought about it before until very recently, that the party with the less popular issue position is always the most internally, the more internally heterogeneous of the two. So if you think about the Republicans on the abortion issue, this is an issue where, I mean, if you read Ezra Klein's book, there's a statement in there that says, well, everyone knows that Republicans are extremely homogeneous on abortion. Everyone knows that every Republican stands for a nationwide ban on abortion. And that is just not true. The party is extremely divided on this issue, and it's one where it's kind of it's a losing issue for the party at this point. And it's also an issue on which the party is extremely heterogeneous. There are some elites who are really in favor of a strict nationwide ban, but then there are lots of voters that just look in the survey research, even before the Dobbs decision, it was clear that lots of Republican identifiers view themselves as very centrist on the abortion issue, and they're sort of vaguely pro-choice, depending on the conditions and so on. And Democrats have a similar thing going on with issues like affirmative action on immigration. It depends on how you ask the question, but there are a lot of issues on which you can get the average voter in the survey is on the anti-immigration side or anti-affirmative action side. And these are issues where those who call themselves Democrats have very high standard deviations. They're very heterogeneous. This is a graph that's a little hard to look at, a little hard to talk about, but I'll try to just walk you through it quickly. This is taking some issues in the 2016 American National Elections study and taking the difference on the horizontal axis, the difference between the survey mean and the question midpoint, which I'm going to tell you, I'm going to interpret as we move to the right, public opinion favors Republicans. As we move to the left, public opinion favors Democrats. And then I'm going to take the difference between the standard deviation of answers for people who call themselves Democrats and the standard deviation of the answer for people who call themselves Republicans, and put that on the vertical axis. I'm going to call that the difference in heterogeneity. So the Democrats are more heterogeneous as we move to the north, and Republicans are more heterogeneous as we move to the south. So there's a really strong relationship between these two things. So on the issues where the public opinion sort of favors the Democrats, and a lot of these are social issues like protection of gay rights. I think you can just kind of look at these. Should more money be spent on schools? Should more money be spent protecting the environment? These are issues where you get some pretty big majorities in favor of the Democratic perspective. And these are issues on which Republicans are extremely heterogeneous. And you can also do the same thing on some of these other issues on the other side, like the death penalty, spending on the military. What's the affirmative action is one that's way up there, where there's a lot of heterogeneity in the Democratic Party, and the people express sort of the views that the average person in the survey express views that are more on the side of the Republican platform on the issue. So this is the thing that's going on. What about time series variation? Well, this is where I can show you lots of issue by issue things. We don't have time for that. This is not ideal, but what I'm going to show you here are just some issue scales that are created by taking lots of questions that are in the survey repeatedly over a long period of time, and then doing something like factor analysis. We can do it in different ways. We can come up with an issue scale. They all kind of tell us similar things. That on economic issues and on moral issues, we see some divergence of means between the parties. So we have on the left side of these graphs, we have means, and we have Democrats and Republicans, and the gaps between those are increasing. Interesting thing on moral issues, when you take the questions that have been asked in the survey, everybody's moving to the left on issues like gay rights, subtly on abortion, but on a lot of these issues, there's this kind of slow movement to the left. And so what that means, if you look at the standard deviation on the right-hand side, we're looking at the standard deviation over time. We see standard deviations on social issues are really increasing for Republicans, because it's kind of, as the whole electorate is moving slowly to the left on these issues, it creates, there are lots of people who stay right where they are in the Republican Party, but then there are lots of people in the middle who are kind of moving over and making the party more heterogeneous. So there's a lot more I could say about this, but then I want to kind of get you to this question. Well, what does this have to do with heterogeneous parties and hostility? Why does this matter? And I just wanted to think about the debate the other night in which my daughter, who is in high school and she's in a government class, and she had an assignment, which is to take a piece of graph paper, watch the debate, make columns for the candidates and rows for the different issues, and write down what the platforms are of the candidates. Well, she had a rough night. She was watching the debate and she was saying, Dad, all he's saying is that Harris is terrible, and all Harris is saying is that Trump is terrible, and I can't distill any kind of platform in this. And it relates to what Didi was saying about the platforms. In 2020, they didn't even write a platform. Just said, well, we'll just use the last one. That was fine. So it makes no sense when your voters don't agree with your elites to actually have a platform. It's better to avoid saying what your party would do in office. A much better strategy is to talk about the other party. And so the heterogeneity in your party makes it so it's less beneficial to talk about your platforms, but the heterogeneity in the out party gives you a very powerful tool. It gives you AOC, it gives you Bernie Sanders, it gives you people you can talk about who say things that your voters think don't sound very good. And so you can even create a television cable network that is really dedicated to this messaging strategy, which is to give the microphone to the people in the out party who say extreme things. You don't have to make the things up. You can just put the microphone in front of the people who are saying things, and have them on as guests and so forth. So it's this characterization of the out party as extreme that Gary and I think is really a big part of what's happening. It's not new. This is something that's always been happening in American politics, but it's something that the parties have really doubled down on recently. And so, what are the implications of this? What happens? What we argue happens is that people eventually start to believe things about the out party. They start to have a biased perception of the out party. They start to believe that the out party's views are dominated by its most extreme members. But that is a view that people start to eventually internalize. So I want to do a little comparative thing here, and then I'll stop. In the comparative study of electoral systems, there's a question that asks people to place the parties on a 10-point scale from far left to far right. And you could take people who like a party and people who don't like a party, and you could take the means among those people, and I'm going to plot those on the X and the Y axis. And so you see that people are right on the 45-degree line. People who don't like the Social Democrats and people who do like the Social Democrats, will put them in exactly the same place on average. And I can show you this for Sweden, I could show this for Germany, I can go around these multi-party systems in Europe, and they're all on the 45-degree line. And so from the American National Election Study, this is what the US looks like. So I think, and this is something I've just been puzzling through, and there's a lot I'd like to understand about this, but what this means is that people who support the Republicans believe that the Democrats are far more to the left than people who support the Democrats. But there's a little asymmetry where for lots of the 80s and the 90s, the Democrats and Republicans were more similar in their estimation of where the Republicans are. But now in the last few years, you see where 2020 is. Now it's kind of moving to be very similar to what we have here. So now in 2020, and I'm sure in 2024, we'll have another dot that's even further out, that people have got these views of the out party that are very distinctive. And so if we take these gaps between the 45-degree line and the observation, and we count those over countries, the US is like in a class by itself. So we misperceive the out party in a way that is quite unique. And so what I want to leave you with is something related to that. I could show you that graph. I'm going to show you a different one that I think captures the same flavor. This is in this survey. If we take the 10-point scale that I described, people are being asked to describe the out party's platform. We take the standard deviation of that. So just what's the standard deviation of people's views of the party's platforms? So Americans have extremely heterogeneous views of the party's platforms. And I've got some other measures I use of heterogeneity of people's views of parties. But in comparative perspective, we have really heterogeneous parties, and we have really heterogeneous views of perceptions of the parties. And like I told you, we have these big gaps between the supporters and the detractors and where they believe the parties are. Those things are very correlated with average affect toward the out parties. So when the parties are heterogeneous and when people really disagree about what they stand for, that's where we really see negative affect toward out parties. So I could say more about that. It's still all work in progress, but I'll just leave you with this, that I think American party elites invest in demonizing their opponents because their own voters disagree with them on a wide range of policies. This is the optimal strategy when your voters don't really like what you have to say, if you were to say a lot about what your elites are up to. So the best thing to do, and this is true on both sides, is to exploit the divisions in the out party and to talk all the time about all the crazy, depraved, nasty things that these people would do if they were in office. And so if we think about a very heterogeneous out party and you think about it as a lottery, and if you're risk averse, it's really scary to think that these really crazy people might be the ones making the policies if we let that out party win. That's very different than if you have a lot of more homogeneous parties, which we have in much of Western Europe. And so this logic really seems to work differently in multi-party systems, and this is one of the ways, perhaps, in which affective polarization can be reduced in some other settings. So I'll leave you with that, and hopefully there's more to talk about later. Thank you.
Where do I press play? How do I press play? Sorry, I'm not familiar with PowerPoint. Bottom right.
And you see this little thing?
Slide. Sorry,
Yeah.
I just don't do PowerPoint. Sorry. Oh, right, not left.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, beautiful. Great, thank you. So thanks very much for having me. Thank you to Jonathan for bringing up the Netherlands, because that gives me some tenuous connection to the rest of the panel. So I will talk about illiberal populists and how they lose, some lessons from Europe. This is not based on a huge sample, but nonetheless, hopefully you will learn something. And what I want to do is to make 3 points. First of all, tell you what this illiberal populism is, right? That's basically been taking off across Europe. I'll give you a bit of a flavor of what these trends in Europe look like, how these parties arise and where they are. And then for the optimistic part of the talk, how some of them lose and basically get trounced by Democrats. So illiberal populism makes 2 kinds of claims. The first part is the populist part. And following Casmude and others, all populist parties have 2 claims in common. The first one is that the existing elites, whether presidents, prime ministers, whatever, are basically corrupt, unaccountable, and unresponsive. That they're in effect sort of an elite cartel that's entirely self-serving. Secondly, as a result of that, that people as such need to be represented. So we're not talking about representation on the basis of issue preferences, of policies, even of class, but of really the entire sort of nation. And of course, that begs the question of how that nation is defined. Now, these parties are illiberal because they're profoundly anti-institutional. They don't have much respect for the rule of law or for minority rights. They, in fact, view those entirely instrumentally. So it's the rule by law rather than the rule of law. And they have a very exclusivist notion of who the people are, excluding all kinds of vulnerable minorities, immigrants, racial, religious, and other minorities. And we've basically seen these parties emerge across Europe. This is kind of a rogues gallery of Giorgia Meloni doing her imitation of Eva Peron, a characteristically jaundiced-looking Viktor Orban from Hungary, Geert Wilders, who exemplifies my dictum that you can find the best hair among illiberal populists. This holds up over and over again. And of course, Jarosław Kaczynski, the leader of the illiberal populist party in Poland. The crown on his head is entirely coincidental. Now, we care about these parties, and we ought to take them both literally and seriously because of what they do to the formal institutions of democracy. Their number 1 target are the formal institutions of accountability and oversight, the guardrails that keep governing parties from basically doing too much damage to democracy. Among these, the number 1 target are the courts. And they basically try to politicize the courts and bring them under parliamentary control, robbing courts of judicial autonomy in the name of bringing that control to the people. The most notorious example in Europe here is Hungary, where the entire set, all of the judicial appointments in the entire country were basically placed in the hands of one person who happened to be the wife of the number 2 official of the governing party with basically no legal experience. They also go after the media. That means going after independent media through taxation, through kind of restrictive regulations, and after the state media, which are then transformed into government mouthpieces. We're not familiar with state media in the United States, but almost every place else, there's sort of when it looks good, it's the BBC. When it doesn't, it's the Polish national TV. But the upshot is that there are these state media that basically get suborned and become government mouthpieces. And finally, there's civil society, which gets hounded out of its role as an independent observer of what the government does through, again, tax laws, regulations, and registration requirements that, for example, force these organizations to register as foreign agents. And if this goes on long enough, what we see are changes in the electoral law and changes in the constitution that basically guarantee incumbency to these parties. Again, here the prize winner is Hungary, where the party basically came to power and within 6 months implemented an entirely new constitution that basically had guarantees for its incumbency ad infinitum. But if the formal institutions are the bricks, the informal institutions are the mortar of democracy. And here, what these parties also do are violate basic norms that make liberal democracies function, such as the acceptance of an opposition and the fact that it's legitimate, tolerance of criticism, whether in the media or from civil society, minority rights with majority rule, and fundamentally sort of a set of shared truths about election outcomes, about the role of the judiciary, and so on. And unfortunately, these parties have been on the rise. So this is just a graph of their electoral share. The green are the developed democracies, the sort of OECD, the early OECD countries. And you can see that starting in the 90s, you have sort of significant takeoff in their popularity. The red are the post-communist democracies. And here, basically, once they start holding free elections in 1990, support for them is already higher and it more than doubles. And these parties include the AfD in Germany, which has just won over 30% in 3 different states. It's the Dutch Party for Freedom, led by Geert Wilders. It's the Sweden Democrats, the Spanish Vox, the Australian Freedom Party, and so on. The laundry list is unfortunately a long one. But populists also lose. There's a very triumphant Polish opposition leader. He was literally pumping his fist to the point where people started making fun of him. But so they lose in the Polish parliament in 2023. They lose the Czech presidency in 2023. And this summer, most sort of notably, France basically was the site of a very sort of tense election where nonetheless the National Rally lost. So that of course begs the question of why do some populists lose? And social scientists being who we are, there's sort of 3 different explanations for why some populists eventually stand to lose. And these focus on popular mobilization, on elite coordination, and on the populist's own performance while in office. So first, there's turnout. Now here, turnout is of course wonderful because it legitimates democratic elections. There's a huge difference between an election where 10% of the electorate participate versus one where 90% do. It brings in new cohorts of voters, especially young voters, and that was critical for sort of, basically defeating some of these populists. And this kind of increased turnout, this extensive mobilization among new cohorts of voters, are basically what defeated illiberal populism in both Poland and in France. Ironically enough, it did almost nothing in the UK, right? Where in the most recent elections, Starmer won with actually a much lower turnout than before. There's also some evidence, though, that especially in East Central Europe, populists actually increased turnout simply by participating in the elections. So, and they sort of have a mobilization power all their own. So turnout is a kind of double-edged sword. On one hand, it mobilizes new voters. On the other hand, in some cases, it helps the populists. So then if the voters can't save us, can the elites? Well, here there are basically 2 different strategies that the elites might choose. They can choose to co-opt, or they can choose to basically erect a cordon sanitaire around sort of these unattractive parties. And the cooptation strategy was taken in the Netherlands. This is Dylan Jeschelgus standing next to Geert Wilders with the hair, who basically was allowed to join the governing coalition, right, as sort of fully fledged member of the coalition. Moreover, she and her party, which is a mainstream center-right party, under her leadership, that party started to move much closer toward Geert Wilders and their sort of very strongly Islamophobic, anti-immigrant stances. So this was an attempt to basically accommodate, in many ways, the Party for Freedom. There was a similar strategy in Sweden, where the Sweden Democrats now support the government. But the problem with this strategy is that it doesn't simply work, right? What happens is that center-right parties that accommodate these illiberal populists wind up losing their electorate rather than sort of successfully absorbing the electorate of the far right. Because your average anti-immigrant and Islamophobic voter takes a look at the center right and says two things. One, fantastic. So all parties are now adopting my preferred stance. And two, why should I go for the watered down version when I have the real thing right here? So cooptation simply doesn't work. There's some evidence that it might for the left, but I don't trust it. So the other option, of course, is to erect a cordon sanitaire. And that is exactly what happened in the French snap election this summer, where, again, because of these two election rounds, what basically happened is in the first round, the National Rally won the elections, and then all the other parties coordinated. And they coordinated in two ways. First, they told their voters to absolutely not to vote for the National Rally. And two, they then strategically dropped out of certain electoral districts to make sure that the more powerful party in each district would win, so long as it kept out the National Rally. And this is not new. There was a similar strategy that was followed 3 other times in the past. Similarly, in Austria, in the most recent elections in September, the Freedom Party, led by Herbert Kickl, he unfortunately doesn't have interesting hair, basically won the elections, right? It won a minority of the vote, but it won the elections. But it could not form a governing coalition. All the other parties announced immediately and committed themselves to not working with this party in the coalition. And so a month and a half later, the center-right party has been tasked with forming the government because these guys couldn't do it. So this kind of cordon sanitaire seems to work much better. And finally, there's kind of the incompetence, if you will, of the populists themselves. Now, support for this kind of illiberal populism is largely driven by insecurity, largely about immigration, largely about public good provisions, about crime, about everything that immigration brings with it. And so the charge that populists initially make is that the mainstream parties, and I agree with Didi, it's entirely about the mainstream parties and their weakness. They basically make the charge that these mainstream parties have been unable to meet the challenge. They get to office on the strength of those claims, but then it turns out that these are not easy issues to deal with. And then, in fact, the populists themselves have a hard time addressing immigration, public welfare provision, and so on. And so what basically happens is that because they find it so hard to address the issues that got them into office, they choose a different strategy, which is to guarantee themselves incumbency by basically changing the institutional framework, by going after the courts, the media, and the electoral laws, and so on. So the implication here is, and you can be pessimistic or optimistic, is that populists lose while they still can, right? There's this window of opportunity before these illiberal populists change the system too much and make it impossible for the opposition to win. So as a result, these parties lost in Poland, but they probably won't lose in Hungary, where the system has been transformed beyond recognition once the party got into power. It also suggests that there might be an authoritarian tipping point, which we see in places like, to some extent, Russia, but definitely Hungary and definitely Turkey. So what are the lessons for the United States? Well, I will say they're limited, unfortunately. Partly because of the differences in the institutional system. We have a very different system of division of power. We have far fewer players. Ballots are translated into seats very differently. And above all, we only have single round elections. So that kind of elite coordination isn't happening. There are similarities of polarization, immigration, and a lot of grievance among the electorate. But this is a case in the United States, not of the center-right co-opting the populists, but the populists co-opting the entire center-right, right? Of basically taking over the Republican Party. So in conclusion, when it comes to figuring out why and how populists lose, I think that populists can mobilize voters, but turnout is very much a double-edged sword. The elite strategy of co-optation is self-defeating, but cordon sanitaires can keep them out. And finally, what we can most sort of count on, but only for a limited time, are the hard realities of governance and the populist's own incompetence. Thank you. Oh, you want to come up?
Yes, it was you on.
Sure. Okay, now it's a steady green. You can hear me? Okay. So Mike and I have agreed to share our moderating. Yes, in a sort of elite coalition here. It's our strategy. We'll see whether it's optimal, a stable equilibrium or not. So I am going to ask 2 questions to Hakeem and Didi, and then you are going to ask Jonathan and Anna. And once you guys answer, we will then turn to the audience. All right, everyone, so hang in there. So my first question, I guess, is it goes to Hakeem. And I want to sort of push on you touched on Black men actually are not any more supportive or less supportive of Harris than Democrats in the past. And so I want to push on why you think this exaggerated narrative has come out. And to the extent that it's true, sort of drawing on some of what Jonathan has argued and a little bit with Didi as well, is it that the Democratic Party has now become so heterogeneous that they don't see themselves as in as captured by the Democratic Party anymore, that it's too liberal, and that they become a victim of this kind of othering strategy that Jonathan talked about that makes the most sense. So yeah, is that what it is? And is Trump kind of leading or following in terms of hitting this on racial division? I suppose is my sub question, not related. Okay, Didi.
You want to?
Oh, okay. Do you want? You're going to ask a question now? You want to turn?
Do you want to let Hakeem answer your question before you move on to the next one?
No, I don't. No.
Perfectly coordinated.
Yes, right. Yeah. No.
This is that last slide about us.
Yes. No, I don't yet. And then I'll ask Didi. This is more about the illiberal populism in the United States that you described and the sort of weakness of parties. And, obviously a lot of people will describe the Republican Party now as the party of Trump. And so as has been, I guess I read a recent article saying that, J.D. Vance is the new face of MAGA. Can this kind of new party of Trump, Republican Party, survive Trump? Or is he just such a populist that this is not transferable? It's a personalistic movement, and we'll go back to a previous equilibrium, the old Republican Party. Do you want to ask your questions, or do you want them to each answer? Okay, why don't you guys each answer, and then we'll turn to the end.
Your mics are on?
I think so. Yeah, it seems so. I want to be transparent that I think that we don't quite know what the ultimate distribution of Black male support for the party's candidates will be. This is one poll, but many folks in the room know how these things sort of jump around. And so I just want to be sort of transparent about that. But these articles and analyses that have been written most recently note that about 20%, upwards of 20% of Black men would be supporting the Republican Party. Republicans historically get somewhere around 13, maybe 15%. 20% would be a notable kind of jump for the Republican Party. Barack Obama, which is, I think, the campaign that people mistakenly keep in mind when they think about what Black folks will do in these elections, of course, was able to get, I was looking at numbers this morning, around 95% of Black American support. There was a very minor gender gap between Black men and Black women, as historically is the case for Democratic support, but it was marginal and not really worth us talking about. There is, even in this poll, we see among likely Black voters a gender gap, that Black male support is weaker than Black women's support for the party. But at least in these numbers, which are more in a space that I would believe, you get about 7 to 10%, not 20%. I still think there's a lot worth thinking about this sort of gender heterogeneity. And I want to also note that this is not, I'm not an intersectionality scholar, where I think this work is perhaps most interestingly done. But Jane Junn, our colleague Lauren Davenport, pointed me to this piece that Jane Junn had written, I think just earlier this year. And the piece was really about the politics of white women, but there were some interesting data points about race and gender across groups that was noteworthy. I'll just note it quickly here, which is that you do see among a share of Black men support for notions of what scholars call hostile sexism, for example. So items that comprise the scale include when a woman a woman just wants to get a man on a leash, sort of thing, and hold him there. So there is this sort of degree of hostile sexism that we observe among Black men that's higher, unsurprisingly, than Black women. We know that some Black men have conservative attitudes when it comes to social issues that the Democratic Party is increasingly touting. But I think it's still an open question, Catherine, is to sort of what to make of what moves we see. The last thing I'll say is that, and data that I've looked at, we see that Black men are more likely to endorse by slight margins these sorts of bootstrap narratives, for example. And I've talked with some folks in our department about whether that's a question worth our collective pursuit, right? Is there something really gendered about this sort of bootstrap narrative that we might understand not just the politics of Black men, but Latino men as well, who are more likely to buy into this sort of neoliberal bootstrap mentality? I think it's really good that we're paying attention to this question. I do think the narrative has been exaggerated, but I'll let Didi go, and we can talk more about Trump in a bit.
All right, I think this is on. I mean, I think the question of can the Republican Party survive Trump is like what everybody is interested in knowing. I will note that in 2012, there was a Republican autopsy, famously what it was referred to after Mitt Romney lost, in which the party noted that it was, not doing a good job reaching out to younger voters or women or voters of color, and that it needed to be a more inclusive party and to change some of its positions, and sort of in line with some of what Jonathan was saying about the heterogeneity. And the party has definitely not gone in that direction. Now, I think a lot of people have said that the reason the party was so quickly able to be taken over by Trump is because he performs well electorally, and so do candidates who are associated with him. I think that therefore they would need to be electorally defeated for the party to really reckon with what, extremism within its own ranks means. But I also think it could, like, external actors could maybe put pressure on the Republican Party if there were really high profile if there was a high profile consensus among, say, business leaders or certain types of members of the community who don't usually get super political, the military, for example, and we've seen some of this, individual generals or individual business leaders have said Trump is not the guy for them. But at the same time, you've had individual business leaders and individual members of the military say, like, well, maybe not the military, but other high profile people say that Trump is fine, or that they need to accommodate him because he's maybe kind of dangerous or maybe good for business and taxes. If there were more cohesion that was really high profile about the dangers of Trump or how he presents a risk to other things you might care about, like the American economy or various other things, then maybe the Republican Party would start to redirect itself. But there's a lot of interesting, very recent evidence about how well extremist candidates do because of having a two-party system. So there's not really like a sort of, you can't really siphon off extremists to another party and relegate them away from the mainstream political system. And also, we now have such a disaggregated system of campaign finance that candidates running in some vaguely conservative district can now get a lot of outside financing from people who don't live in that district, and that can really propel them to victory as well. So that's not really an answer. I do think that if Trump definitively loses next Tuesday, the Republican Party has a much better chance of sort of rewriting itself, no pun intended. But if he wins, I think that there's, the party is kind of lost. And if the Republican Party were going to come back, it'd probably be in some different form.
Okay, so I want to thank Jonathan and Anna for two just fascinating presentations. And I'm going to keep things short by just asking one quick question to each of them. And I guess I'll ask you to keep your answers relatively short too, to leave time for Q&A. So my question for Jonathan is, you argue that US parties are not becoming more homogeneous, which is, I think, surprising to a lot of people, and that's the way you set up your presentation. I think it's especially surprising given Didi's observation that more and more Americans are leaving or not affiliating with traditional parties anymore and are declaring themselves to be independents rather than Democrats or Republicans. As presumably moderate voters leave the Democrat and Republican parties and become independents, you would think that those who remain would be more homogeneous and possibly more extreme. So I'm wondering, how do you reconcile your main finding in your presentation with Didi's observation of an increasing percentage of independents in the electorate?
I think part of it is just a technical question of how do we characterize people who are leaning toward one party, who say the first round of the question, say I'm an independent, and then they get pushed and they say, but I lean toward the Republican. So I was including those people in some of the analyses in which I'm describing the parties as becoming more heterogeneous. But I think it still also can be the case, though, that people are increasingly, that they're turned off by that these strategies that I described, in which the parties are being pitched as very extreme. That's part of what turns people off to the parties and leads them to start calling themselves independents, because they find that one of the really important findings of so-called negative partisanship in the United States is that people become more disdainful toward the out party, but no warmer toward the in party. And so that leads some people to just say to hell with all of them and call themselves independent. So I don't see that basic fact as being inconsistent with the larger narrative.
Great, thanks. Okay, and a question for Anna. So Anna, you argued that elites can thwart populists by coordinating against the populists, and gave some examples in Europe of where that was the case. I mean, to me, that raises the question, what causes elites to coordinate effectively in some cases and not others? And I'm wondering if, drawing on your knowledge of Europe, you have some thoughts about when that's more or less likely to take place.
But you all have to realize that when Mike Toms asks a question at any talk, everybody lives in fear. So this is my moment of fear, and I've conquered it, and I'm going to answer the question.
Usually 3 parts, though. He only gets to have one part.
And it's usually, your theory makes no sense.
Limited time.
Right. So, I think the elite coordination is really aided by 2 things. One is the institutions, right? It's much easier to coordinate if you're forming a coalition. It's much easier to coordinate if you have a 2-round electoral systems. And so there are all kinds of ways in which, or a proportional representation system, there are all kinds of ways in which institutions make it much easier for the elites to coordinate. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say, it's also much easier to coordinate when the power is built. One person. And if they choose to and can overcome the obvious coordination problems, they'll succeed. But once the system has been changed by the would-be authoritarian, it's too late. Okay.
All right. So now we're going to open to questions, and Nora is roving with the microphone. So Nora, I see one there.
But I working class, middle class, like white individuals who are feeling left behind, like the former dominant culture. And I think I've really been struggling with like the disparity between like there's this like civic nationalism, universal conception, and then there's this populist response with groups that are like feeling like their government is no longer responsive to them. Do you see civic nationalism as something that is inherently flawed and cannot work as like a form of nationalism for a country? Or do you see like the recent defeats of like various populist groups as maybe a potential for civic nationalism to have its place in various nations?
So, I think civic nationalism in many ways is kind of a contradiction in terms. Only because, if civic nationalism asks us to sort of subscribe to a set of ideals and principles, and that's what identifies us, that's often very thin gruel. And I think that's what populists, often realize. What they want is a much sort of, blood and bones kind of nationalism, one that subscribes to, ancient histories and sort of, mythical sort of traditions, but really puts some meat on the bones of this very sort of thin version of civic nationalism. And they succeed. And they succeed largely because a lot of the countries in Europe were relatively homogeneous until the waves of immigration. And the earlier waves of immigration, were contained, right? I mean, there are only Turks coming to Germany in this highly limited numbers, and they never got citizenship. Now there's, there's sort of wave after wave of immigrants, especially after 2015. And a lot of people feel like their countries are unable to absorb that, either culturally or economically or sort of, politically. And I think that's where the sort of, the problem arises, right? In that situation, that kind of sort of, bloody nationalism becomes all the more attractive because it's a defense of this mythical past.
Great.
Thank you.
Do you want to bring maybe up here? I see Miriam and then Max. So Miriam first, and maybe we should collect two and then go back.
Thank you so much. Is this on? Okay, my name is Miriam Golden. I'm a visitor at CDDRL. Up more. Okay. So Jonathan, I was fascinated by your presentation, which is incredibly interesting and novel data analysis. But my question is the following. If the parties have platforms that no longer reflect the views of their voters, why don't they change their platforms? You seem to have taken the party position as fixed and exogenous, but of course the party position is something that parties devise. So why are parties so out of touch with what their voters want?
Yeah, that's something that I thought a lot about. I mean, I don't think the parties have fixed exogenous platforms. On the contrary, I don't think U.S. parties have platforms. It is not a thing that exists. It is a bunch of people with a D next to their name saying things. Some of them on television, some of them, so Alyssa Slotkin gets very little attention. AOC gets a lot of attention. And so there's all these people saying things, and the platform is kind of is some kind of a weighted mean of all those things, and then it's weighted more by how much attention that people get. And so I think that the parties don't really, the elites in the parties have a bunch of ideas and they say a lot of things. And so on the abortion issue, the elites in the Republican Party, many of them have a set of views that are distinctive from the rest of the party. So, right, why don't they just change the platform? I think in a like a presidential system where there is no device that allows you to discipline people for saying the wrong thing, everybody can just say whatever they want. Everybody with an R next to their name can say what they want, and they do. And so it's very different than a disciplined party where there's a platform and there is a no confidence procedure, and people can get punished if they don't cooperate. So I think, and it goes along with a lot of what you're saying.
Okay, I see Max up here. Right there. Oh, come on. Everyone knows Max, right?
Hi, thank you all so much for the talk. It was very interesting points. I'm Max. I'm a current senior at Stanford studying international relations. I had a question combining the ideas of polarization, heterogeneity within the parties with the illiberal populism concept. Because from my understanding in Europe, the most prescient dangers when it comes to the power of illiberal populism is often when you have like very coordinated parties that can really put an impact on both the institutions and the democratic norms in the society. But in the case where in the United States you have very heterogeneous parties, I was wondering how much of an impact do we think actually illiberal populism can have in those contexts? Like, I forget how many votes it took in the House of Representatives in order to elect Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Like, when you can't even get past the procedural elements in these parliamentary assemblies, like how much degradation of the institutions and the actual norms can you actually achieve? So I'm very interested in that as we see this election come up.
Is that to Jonathan, Anna, or
to all the members? Yes, mostly to Jonathan and Anna. Yeah.
Okay, can you hang on before answering that? And I think there was another question over here. Camille. Okay, not using my full peripheral vision. Yep.
So I had a quick question, both for Hakeem and for Jonathan, or separate questions. So for Jonathan, I was really um, surprised by, but also convinced by your data on party heterogeneity. But just to push back on that a bit or get some more specificity, some of the trends that you talk about, like increasing racial or ethnic diversity, increasing college attendance, are happening to the country at large at the same time as they're happening within parties. And I was wondering if like the rate of heterogeneity year over year is increasing more rapidly within the party compared to the rate that that's just happening to the country overall year by year. So are the Republicans becoming like more racially diverse, the Democrats becoming more racially diverse than just the country, or people over 18 are in a given year? And the same thing for college education. And I'm not sure how well that would apply to things like class, but for college education and race, that's like a general trend. And then for Hakeem, I was like thinking back to Barack Obama's 2008, 2012 campaigns, and there being certain times when he referred to his marriage to Michelle Obama as something that increased his credibility with the Black community. And I was reflecting on some work by Renee Flores in UChicago sociology that I've seen on perceptions of interracial relationships differing between like the perception of a white male, of a Black male, of a white female, of a Black female, depending also on the people in the relationship. Do you have any sense of whether Kamala Harris's marriage to Doug Emhoff is something that negatively, positively impacts her perception among Black male voters?
Or has no effect, right? It's possible. Okay, so I guess, do you want to start with Max, or Max's question to Jonathan, Anna, and maybe Dee Dee as well, and then Camille's?
I sense that Anna wanted to say something about that. Oh, you did? Oh. Well,
I want to talk about Doug Emhoff.
Who wouldn't want to talk about Doug?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question about presidential versus parliamentary democracy, and it kind of relates to the views of Juan Linz, or for that matter, Woodrow Wilson, on some of the deficiencies of presidentialism. But it is, I guess, the question that a lot of people have in mind is how. Yeah, then I think Anna brought this up. How does this type of an Orban type figure operate within a presidential system versus a parliamentary system? And I think that if you are an aspiring autocrat, you probably prefer presidentialism. I mean, that is the Erdogan's take. He thought that would be better than a parliamentary system, and especially if you think that you can take over you can by executive order change lots of things about bureaucracy and the military. Then in some ways the fact that there's not much happening in the legislature is probably not that much comfort to people who are worried about this kind of power centralization. But does that fit with what you had in mind?
What Jonathan said. Plus, I think the real problem in the United States is the sort of populist takeover of a mainstream party. And we're in a two-party system where our choices are now one party that's committed to democracy and another party whose commitment to democracy at this stage, liberal democracy, is, shall we say, shaky at best, right? And that's what's scary. So I think this has less to do with institutions than who actually wields those institutions and who functions within them. And if you have the kind of Republican Congress that Trump would like, and if you have President Trump in power, then not to mention a Supreme Court that's been appointed largely by him, the guardrails are off.
Okay, Hakeem,
I wanted to check with Dee on the institutions point.
anything to add on the institutions point, Dee? Nice.
Camille, the range of Camille's questions, the breadth of her thinking, she's brilliant. But on this question about Doug Emhoff and perceptions of Kamala Harris's Blackness, I didn't plant you there, but I love this question. So as some in the room know, Lauren Davenport and I, along with Hunter Rendelman, who's now a professor at Berkeley, have been thinking a lot about how Americans construct Blackness in mind, something I started thinking about in the aftermath of Rachel Dolezal. And in that work, just very quickly, what we do is we use a Condrate method to really understand how various attributes of one's person weigh in people's sort of perception of them as Black. How Black is one is a question that anyone in the room who thinks about race knows is a question that you can ask. You can ask this about anything. How queer are you? How much of a woman? Because we have these sorts of characteristics and stereotypes and the like. So one of the things that we observe in this work is that all else considered, when a profile is said to be married not to a Black partner, but to a white partner, or is not married at all, that profile, all else considered, skin tone, place of residency, all these things, and all that's taken into account, race of spouse has this unique effect, such that being married to a non-Black spouse makes one less Black in the eyes of the perceiver, both in the eyes of white perceivers and Black perceivers and mixed race Black-white perceivers. And so we know that this kind of choice of an intimate partner matters and individuals' perceptions of how Black one is. And it almost certainly matters in questions about Kamala Harris's Blackness. There are strong norms and beliefs about intermarriage among members of the Black community. Our colleague here at Stanford, Rick Banks, wrote a book called Is Marriage for White People, where he talks at length about some of these norms. I would commend that work to those of you in the room. But I think, Camille, your question is more interesting when I think about it in the context of Trump's trying to talk about Kamala's Blackness. And always a foolish thing for a putative out-group member to question somebody else's belonging to the category. It is normal for Black folks to have conversations, everyday conversations about she's Black, but how Black, right? And this was a conversation that happened around Barack Obama as well. Is he Black enough? And of course, that wasn't about whether he technically and bureaucratically fit into a category, but a question of is he at the cookout and how good is the macaroni? It's a question of whether he has the real stuff, the cultural stuff of Blackness. And that's a question that Kamala Harris's campaign knows well is on the mind of some Black folks. And I'll just finish off here and say that Kamala Harris's campaign has clearly been attentive to this and the way that she has carried herself in Black communities, sitting down in, what is it, Club Shay Shay, the podcast, doing all of these very sort of Black kind of cultural things, going to Black church and dressing the part in Black church. So online, for example, some folks have commented that you never saw Kamala Harris wear pants in a Black church because of some of the norms therein. So Kamala is concerned about being perceived as Black enough. Her campaign is attentive to it. And I think just as Barack Obama did, she has overcome that hurdle.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's interesting that J.D. Vance's wife, who is Indian American, has not been sort of highlighted as well in their campaign as much. We'll leave it at that. Thank you so much, Hakeem, Didi, Jonathan, and Anna. Thank you, Mike. Also, this has been fun this month going through this panel, these three panels. Thank you especially to our audience and to our staff for taking such good care of us and making things run so smoothly. If you haven't done so already, go vote. Next, I guess after the election, the week after the election on the 10th, we will be having our final seminar online, and there's the 12th, pardon me, 10, 12, what's the diff? But a week after the election, we may actually know who won the presidential election by then. Let's hope. Thanks. We'll all watch with tremendous interest. And again, vote.